Hello, everybody, and welcome to this look at a hot labor summer in Hollywood. We've been talking about the writer's strike and the actor strike here on the channel. We had an update video last week. The writers were unfortunately not able to come to terms to continue talks as of now with the group of producers with whom they're negotiating, the AMPTP, and I'm continuing to track that story. But there's another big labor union story that broke just a couple days ago that I wanted to talk about, and that was the news that a group of Marvel VFX or visual effects artists have notified officials that they plan to take a vote on whether or not to unionize. This would be a huge first step in the world of visual effects. There are currently no visual effects artists that are unionized in Hollywood. So I just want to take a look at this situation, break it down. I think there are a couple of misconceptions that I want to clear up, talk about what unions do in Hollywood, share some of my experiences as a non-union worker in Hollywood. So a lot to get to. Before we jump into the story itself, though, there are a couple of organizations I want to introduce right up top because we're going to be talking about them a lot. One of them is IATSE, or the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. It is a union with over 150,000 members. It covers theater, movies, TV in the US and Canada. Basically, these are the craftsmen, the craftspeople that you see on set. Carpenters, grips, hairdressers, makeup artists. They all have their own local unions within IATSE, especially in Los Angeles, but they're all under one big umbrella. And what the visual effects artists are wanting to do is to join this particular union. The other organization is the National Labor Relations Board. It's a government agency that oversees U.S. labor laws and practices for different private businesses, and it also supervises union complaints. So if there's somebody who has expressed interest in being in a union and they feel like a company has pushed back against that, they can go to this board in order to get some sort of relief. And we're also going to be talking about that. So let's talk about these VFX artists that will shortly be holding a union election to decide if they want to become a unionized group. The news was broken by Vulture on Monday that a supermajority of a reported 52 on-set visual effects artists directly employed by Marvel Studios filed a notice with the National Labor Relations Board that they want to hold an election to decide if they will unionize under IATSE. And the workers have requested to have this vote taken as early as August 21st. So we may know this month if the workers as a whole decide to unionize. Now, there's an important distinction that I want to make here, which is that these are VFX artists who are employed directly by Marvel Studios. They reportedly work in Los Angeles, New York, and Atlanta. And it hasn't been in every story, but what I've been able to gather is that these are on-set VFX artists. So these are the people that are on the set every day that are doing the things that you actually have to do while you're shooting in order to do the VFX, the green screen, all of that kind of stuff before it goes over to the digital artists. And that's the distinction I want to make, and that's been kind of muddy. We're not talking about the thousands of artists behind a computer that are actually doing the final finished visual effects that you see in the movies themselves. These are the folks that are on set, and it makes sense that they would be the ones to petition to become part of a union because they spend every day on set alongside all the people I mentioned before that do have union protections. All of the different crew members, the grips, the people in the electrical department, those people are all union. These visual effects people are not union, and they're looking around and they're going like, well, wait a minute. Why aren't we in with these people? So while this isn't exactly the situation that I think a lot of people have made it out to be, because there are no other VFX workers that are currently unionized, this is still a big deal. In a statement, Mark Patch, the VFX organizer for IATSE, said, "For almost half a century, workers in the visual effects industry have been denied the same protections and benefits their co-workers and crewmates have relied upon since the beginning of the Hollywood film industry. This is an historic first step for VFX workers coming together with a collective voice demanding respect for the work we do." And keep in mind, he said there, this is an historic first step. There was also a quote provided from Bella Huffman, who has worked in the past as a VFX coordinator for Marvel Studios. She said, quote, "Turnaround times don't apply to us, protected hours don't apply to us, and pay equity doesn't apply to us. Visual effects must become a sustainable and safe department for everyone who suffered far too long and for all newcomers who need to know that they won't be exploited." And this isn't just relegated to VFX. This has been a movement that's been going on in the past couple years. Labor discussions aren't just confined to the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes that are happening right now. And we've seen a lot of motion, for example, in the animation field. Animators at Rick and Morty and Solar Opposites voted to join the Animation Guild last year. Warner Brothers Animation and Cartoon Network filed for a unionization vote last month. And there was a move recently to extend the union to production workers, not just animators, at Disney and for shows like Family Guy and The Simpsons. And when you read why people are pushing so hard right now to unionize, it comes down to a lot of common complaints. Very long work weeks, especially in the entertainment industry. We're talking 60+ hour work weeks, no guaranteed overtime for time that is actually worked, short turnarounds from the time you go home to the time that you have to go back on set, and then absolutely no access to any kind of healthcare or pension benefits for your profession. It's no secret that visual effects artists working for Marvel have been unhappy for a long time on and off set. On the heels of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania's release, news stories began circulating about the difficult working conditions for VFX artists at Marvel. But these stories have been circulating about Marvel for years, that their movies are built on the back of overworked and underpaid VFX artists, that they are pitting different companies against each other, that they're underbidding and basically trying to get the most work that they can for the least money possible. And it's been speculated that the difficult working conditions for Marvel in the VFX department was one of the reasons why Victoria Alonso, a longtime executive, was suddenly removed from her post earlier this year because she was the head of the visual effects division of Marvel Studios. And when it comes to the visual effects industry, these are not new complaints. Back in 2014, hundreds of visual effects artists protested at the Academy Awards because of a situation that the VFX artists behind the movie Life of Pi found themselves in. As they were on stage accepting the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, they were doing so knowing that the company they worked for, Rhythm and Hues, had been forced to declare bankruptcy just days earlier. The Oscar for Best Visual Effects was presented, ironically, by the cast of The Avengers. And as winner Bill Westenhofer attempted to address the underpaid VFX artists being celebrated, he was played off stage by music.
Including Rhythm and Hues. Sadly, Rhythm and Hues is suffering severe financial difficulties right now. I urge you all to remember.
You know, I'm going to lay my cards out on the table right here because I report these stories as objectively as I can, but on a personal level, and you could probably tell by the tone and tenor of a lot of my coverage of the strikes, I am pro-labor and I am pro-union. I don't think that any union is perfect, and I don't think that unions or all of the actions that unions take are above criticism. I think you can absolutely criticize some of the individual actions that they take, but I think that the protections that they afford are vital to workers. And I actually partially feel that way because I worked in Los Angeles for several years on shows, both union and non-union, in roles that did not fall under union protection. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that they absolutely exploited my labor when I was trying to break into a very tough to break into industry. For example, as a production assistant, I traveled with a crew to shoot a reality show in Missouri, just north of where I am right now. We were shooting for about 7 weeks. Every day, 7 days a week. And in those 7 weeks, I had a total of 2 days off. As far as like completely off, I didn't have to go into work. The days where I was working a minimum of a 12 to 14 hour day every single day, from the minute that I got up and had to go get my producer's Starbucks order in the morning to the minute that I closed down the production trailer at night. It was very common for me to have less than 8 hours turnaround before I had to get up and start another 12 or 14 or 16 hour day. And listen, I'm not afraid of hard work, and production is a business. Making movies, making TV shows, it's a business that oftentimes does require extraordinary effort. And I don't think that anybody is saying that people shouldn't put in extraordinary effort. They're saying that people should be compensated for extraordinary effort when it is necessary to put that effort in. And also that workers should not be exploited and be forced to give extraordinary effort in order to save money, or in order to hire fewer workers, or in order to get things quicker. There have to be some protections to make sure that you're not working 50, 16-hour days in a row. And some people would say, well, if the job sucks so much, then why do you work it? Well, keep in mind, I was 22, 23, 24 years old. I was living literally paycheck to paycheck. I was doing the stuff that really interested me on the side. I didn't have a way to make that my profession. There was no YouTube at that time. It was still in its very early phases. So the idea of talking about movies on the internet just wasn't a viable thing. And I was literally just trying to pay my rent while I was pursuing my other interests and making things in my free time. So the idea of losing a job or pissing off a company so that they don't hire me again was a big deal for me. So of course I was going to work the hours they expected me to work, because that's how I got to keep my job. Otherwise, they'll go out, they'll find somebody else who will work those hours, and I'm gone. I was a post-production assistant for an ABC pilot. I worked on the ABC lot, and it was not uncommon for me to come in at 10 o'clock, wait for a cut to be done until midnight, and then spend another 2 or 3 hours driving the cut to executives' houses to drop it off at their door, get home at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, sleep 4 or 5 hours maybe, then get up for another 12 or 14-hour day. That's just the way that it was done, and that was the expectation. I remember there was one day where it was Easter Sunday, and my boss said, you got to come in because we got to get this cut out. And I said, well, I can't do that. I have plans with my friends. We're having Easter lunch. You know, it's Easter. And I remember she looked me dead in the eyes and she said, LA's a godless city, Dan. And I'm pretty sure she wasn't joking. And I'm not sharing these stories as sort of a woe is me type thing. It's just that I understand when I read these stories where so many of these workers are coming from, because the entertainment industry is so fast paced and requires so much effort to do that if there aren't protections for workers, then of course companies are going to squeeze as much work out of somebody as cheaply as they can, because these are expensive productions. And if there's anything that we've learned about the producers in the last few months or so, it's that they will cut costs and cut corners at any cost. So cheap labor, yes please, as far as they're concerned. Things have undeniably gotten better in Los Angeles since I moved there back in 2005. For example, production assistants are now starting to kind of be accepted into some of these groups that are looking for union protections. For example, some of the staff workers on those animated shows. But I think the irony here, especially when we talk about the visual effects artists, is that this push for unionization is, in my opinion, the direct result of the studios demanding so much of them and cutting costs so much and bidding so low for all this VFX work. If the studios had been compensating VFX artists more, or perhaps making it so that their deadlines work on artists working a 12-hour day instead of an 18-hour day, then I don't think that there would be such a push for unionization. But the working conditions are getting so bad in animation and visual effects and other areas that the workers almost feel like they have no choice but to ask for these protections. And speaking of union protections, because I've mentioned them several times, for people that don't know what exactly a union provides, some people say like, well, wait, you just give them a bunch of money? That sounds kind of like a racket. Why would anybody want to be in a union? It's because they help to establish, first of all, some minimum guarantees. You have a minimum wage that is negotiated through something called collective bargaining. Collective bargaining basically means that if you're a member of the union, then they can go, basically what's happening with the actors and writers right now. The union can go on your behalf and negotiate a contract that will guarantee the minimum amount, for example, of what you can be paid. And it's not like minimum wage. Oftentimes it's called a living wage, and it could be substantially above minimum wage. There's a reason why union jobs are so sought after in many industries. They are generally pretty stable, pretty secure, and they generally also pay pretty well. Now, what you get as a union member varies from industry to industry because every industry is different. But in the entertainment industry, some of the basics that you get as a union member, you get the minimum guaranteed pay. You also get guaranteed meal breaks after a certain number of hours. And if the production has to violate that, basically, if it says in your union contract, well, every 4.5 hours, I get a 30-minute break or an hour break to eat a meal. If the production has to go past that time, if you're shooting a scene or something, then you get paid what's called a meal penalty, which basically means you get extra money because you had to work longer than it says in your union contract. And that's something that assistant directors hate. And having a show be a union show doesn't mean that you can't shoot past a certain amount of time. It's not that the crew walks off set after, 9.5 hours. But it basically does mean that if you're union and you do go past the maximum amount of time that you've guaranteed that your workers will be there, again, they will be compensated. They will be paid overtime. They will be paid penalties. So if a VFX worker has to work a 14, 16-hour day because there's a shot or something or an emergency where, it just has to be done, they are going to be heavily compensated for working that time instead of basically working under a flat contract for however much time they're being told to put into this project. And finally, something that being part of a union will almost always come with is access to health benefits if you work a certain number of hours. Sometimes that even comes with access to pension benefits in some unions. And healthcare was something, for example, that I went without for a large part of my 20s, especially in a pre-Affordable Care Act America. I couldn't afford, honestly, my own healthcare, and none of the jobs that I worked at offered healthcare because they were gig jobs. I was working on jobs for 3 or 4 or 5 months at a time, and they did not extend benefits to somebody who was not a full-time employee. Actually, in the spirit of full disclosure, for the first 2 or 3 years that I worked at Screen Junkies, I was there every day, 8 or more hours a day, so I worked full-time hours, but I was not classified by the company as a full-time employee for over 2 years, which meant that I didn't get health benefits. There were no things like 401k or anything like that. I had to turn in a time card every week, and the only reason that I was ever brought on as an employee and given healthcare benefits was that Break Media, the company I started working at, merged to form Defy Media, and they were big enough that they had to bring on employees who worked more than 40 hours a week as full-time employees by law. Before that, the company was small enough, they could have kept me there working as a quote temporary employee indefinitely, and the justification for that was, well, you're free to go get a job anywhere else that you want to. You're not tied to working here, but at the same time, why would I not want to work there? That was literally the place that I worked. So the benefits to joining a union for a lot of people far outweigh some of the risks or the difficulties with deciding to unionize. So what's next? What's next for these workers that will be taking this vote and deciding if they're going to push to form a union? Well, first, of course, they do have to take that vote to approve unionization. And if that unionization is approved by the members that are voting, in an ideal world, that would be the end of it. They negotiate a contract and that's it. But labor often does not happen in an ideal world, and large companies have a long history of pushing back as hard as they can against organized labor. And the reason for that is pretty simple, which is that big companies love cheap labor. Cheap labor keeps productivity up, it keeps costs down, and when you bring people into a union, that means that you are paying those union members more per hour per person than you were paying them before, 9 times out of 10. You're paying into benefits, you're liable for a lot more, and companies are going to push back against that because that cuts into their margins, their precious, precious margins. Amazon and Starbucks have been fighting unionization hard in the last couple years, and Starbucks in particular has been accused of firing or reducing the hours of pro-union employees and closing pro-union stores. This is something that's called retaliation. And this is where it gets a little complicated because it is technically illegal for a company to retaliate in any way or fire or reduce the hours of an employee who decides that they want to join a union or who advocates pro-union sentiments. They can't do it. Employees who believe that they have been retaliated against can file a grievance with the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. And just yesterday, a federal judge upheld an NLRB ruling saying that 7 Memphis Starbucks employees who were fired must be rehired and made whole, i.e. repaid lost wages, because the court deemed that their termination was in fact retaliatory for supporting unionization. But unfortunately, that is the extent of the government's power here. They can order a company to compensate an employee that was retaliated against. They can order a company to hire that employee back, but they can't levy any kind of a punitive damage against the company. They can basically just say like, hey, you need to pay that person back, and you really have to stop doing that. There's no component that actually punishes the company beyond that, and that's also given the scenario that the National Labor Relations Board can prove that an action taken against an employee was retaliatory. And that's why, as much as I support them and I want them to succeed, I think that these Disney VFX artists are in for a pretty long fight here because first of all, you have to pass this initial vote to unionize, and companies like Amazon have been well known in the past to kind of do the full court press against forming a union to employees, telling them that it's going to be antithetical to what they want. They're going to be in a worse position. The unions are going to take advantage of them. And it has worked in the past. There have been Amazon warehouses that have voted down an attempt to unionize because the company is able to convince them of that. And if Disney's able to convince the majority of this group of 52 on-set VFX artists that it would not be in their favor to join a union, then we won't see the formation of this union yet because they'll say, no, never mind, we don't want to do that. But let's say the vote passes. This is a pretty small group and they seem pretty determined. Next, a contract has to be decided upon. And this is sort of reminiscent perhaps of what's happened with some of these Starbucks stores. You read about 300 plus Starbucks stores that have voted to unionize, which is great, except now they have to go to the company to get a contract before they actually get any of these benefits. And many people in these unionized stores have said that Starbucks is deliberately slow rolling these negotiations, that it takes forever. They have to go to the NLRB, which may even have to go to court in order to get the wheels going. And so it's months and months before people even talk about starting any kind of negotiations. Does this sound familiar? Because this sounds a little familiar to me. So that's the next hurdle, is actually getting a contract done, which could take a very protracted amount of time. And that is all discounting the possibility that Disney, of their own volition, could magically come up with some kind of a workaround for having an on-set VFX team, or perhaps decide for budgetary reasons that they're going to reduce the size of this staff by 2/3. And again, unless anyone can prove that this was a retaliatory action that was a direct result of them deciding to form a union, as far as Disney's concerned, they can claim, hey, listen, no, it doesn't have anything to do with that. We were just looking at the budget for the different VFX for these shows and movies, and we really think that we can operate on about 1/3 of the staff. This doesn't have anything to do with that. What, are you crazy? And unless somebody at Disney wrote an email or scribbled on a piece of paper that they were doing this to screw these unionizing workers, then it's going to be really hard for them to prove that they're actually being retaliated against. It's the kind of plausible deniability that drives people crazy. There was one story I read about a worker at Starbucks in Buffalo, New York, who was very pro-union and was fired, as the company said, for cause, for being 1 minute late to her shift. That was just enough for the company to say, it doesn't have anything to do with the union. She was late. But all of that, believe it or not, is to set aside what I think is the biggest problem that the VFX industry is facing when it comes to unionization, which is that this is a small number of on-set VFX professionals. And it's great that they are taking this first step, but Disney literally employs on a freelance basis thousands of different employees across any number of companies to actually produce these shots. And even if the on-set artists are able to form this union, that will not affect any of these other vendors, any of these other visual effects houses, unless they also decide as a group of workers to take a vote and to unionize. And that's what the next step has to be. For any meaningful change to actually happen in this industry, many more workers are going to have to take that step. But if enough people do decide to follow the lead here, and they do decide to unionize, then this could be looked at as one of the most critical moments in the history of the visual effects industry, because this was the match that started a wildfire of labor reform that actually did start guaranteeing pay for these artists and started guaranteeing overtime and cutting down on these ruinously long days, and maybe started reining in some of the artists on the Marvel side. Some of these directors reportedly that are saying like, oh, I want to change this one thing at the last minute, or you know what, just give me 4 different looks so that I can decide. You may actually have to force them into making creative decisions that allow visual effects artists to work on a manageable schedule. This doesn't seem like the craziest thing in the world, but we also live at a time where these companies will ask anything of the people that work for them, as long as it gets them the result that they want, and they don't think about the human cost of those results. They're going to have to be forced to think about that human cost, and the only way for them to be forced to think about the human cost is to be forced to pay the financial cost. I hope this is looked at as the moment when things change for the VFX industry, because they do deserve to be paid, because their work is important, and it's used as the selling point for so many of these movies. It's not just for VFX. I hope that animation and production assistants and everyone out there is able to get a livable wage that's fair for the amount of work that they're putting in. I know a lot of people see the entertainment industry as frivolous, but it is an industry. And for everybody that says like, oh, well, why should I care if somebody that's working on this Marvel show or whatever gets paid more? Okay, fine. If you don't want the writers to get paid more, if you don't want the directors to get paid more, that's your decision. But 90% of the people that work on She-Hulk, which is the show that gets cited over and over again as a reason why writers and actors and directors don't deserve more pay, Most of the people that work on that show are blue collar people. They're carpenters and grips and electricians and makeup artists and VFX artists. And they honestly probably don't even really care about Marvel. They don't really care about these characters. This is how they earn a living. This is how they pay for their houses. This is how they put food on the table. This is how they support their families. And they should not be locked out of the ability to do that just because they chose a job in the entertainment industry, which some people regard as frivolous. All right, I'm getting a little too fired up, so I'll wrap things up here by saying that I think that we are approaching a watershed moment when it comes to the labor movement in Hollywood. And the big question that I think stands out right now is, who is going to benefit? Will the workers benefit, or will the studios benefit? Because I think that any ground that is given up or gained right now will be ground that is given up or gained for decades. And that's why so many of these things are high stakes. And that's why this story about a small group of on-set VFX artists at Marvel is, to me, almost as consequential as the overarching story that we've been covering about the writers and the actors that are currently on strike. So stay tuned right here on the channel. I'm continuing to cover the strikes. I will continue to cover this story. And thank you so much for spending part of your day here with me. If you have any other questions, leave it down in the comments below. I hope this was useful to you if you didn't know exactly what was going on right now. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then.